One of the silver linings of 2020 has been the awakening of many camp professionals to the glaring lack of diversity in the camp industry. Besides camps that cater to inner city children, summer camp, like many American institutions, has historically been a white proposition. Today, we will discuss what we can do within our own organizations to help make change. Thank you for joining us for this important discussion. This is the Day Camp Pod. Welcome back, my friends, to the Day Camp Podcast. I'm Andy Pritikin, Director of Liberty Lake in the Philly suburbs of New Jersey.
I'm Sam Thompson from Crystal Lake Park District, Crystal Lake, Illinois.
I'm Tiffany Grattan McDuffie from Purposeful Play, both in Milwaukee, Wisconsin and Chicago, Illinois.
And we are Day Camp pros dedicated to the professional development of our colleagues, discussing topics and best practices that can improve our organizations and ourselves. And we are joined today by two exceptionally awesome individuals, graduates of Project Maury, mentees of Dawn Ewing, who have taken their camp experiences and applied them into impressive careers in education. Dr. Lance Ozier, zooming in from Georgia. I thought I was going to be able to say Switzerland. I had a chocolate joke all lined up, and now it's done. And Dr. Chanika Perry, zooming in from, I thought I was going to say Atlanta, but she's in South Carolina, right?
I am, yes.
I love it. Zoom is an amazing thing. So let's start with you, Chanika, ladies first. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and why you think, sort of end up with why you think camp is such a unique opportunity to make progress in the realm of diversity, equity, inclusion.
Absolutely. So thank you for having us today. This is really exciting. I am Dr. Chanika Perry, born in good old Fort Campbell, Kentucky, but I can't really call that home because Georgia, I was only there for 2 weeks. So Georgia is what I kind of breathe and know. So even though my mom is over here in Columbia, South Carolina, good old Atlanta is home. So I am a proud Atlanta resident. I have been in education and youth development, as you mentioned, for about 20 years, started with Dawn Ewing. I don't think there's a better way to start, to be honest, in this field. And so I started there with Project Maury and then have just worked my way through the New York City Department of Education, Atlanta Public Schools, and now I am at Hands-On Atlanta as the Director of Education Programs. I think when I think about why camp matters, right, and why we have to talk about diversity, I think about all of the little Black and brown kids like myself who don't necessarily see themselves in camp. Like I never went to camp as a kid. No one ever talked to me about camp as a kid. It was just something I saw on TV anytime camp would come up, and it always came up with horseback riding. Don't know what that says, but it was very elitist. And so for us, growing up on my little dirt road, it was an impossibility. And so I never knew what it had to offer. It looks like an amusement park for kids, right? That they were able to go to, but you had to have money to go there. And I didn't see anyone who really looked like me ever at camp. So I didn't necessarily position myself there, or I think that there was anything of relevance for me. And so it's ironic almost that my first foray into camp was as an adult when I decided to work at a summer camp, just to beta test if I wanted to work with kids for life. I thought I was going to be a teacher, and I just needed to know after my first year of undergrad if I was going down the right road. And so I had to know if I loved kids first, and camp just seemed like a place I could go in the summer, a sleepaway camp that was, to figure it out. And so when I think about why this matters and why diversity matters, it's because I don't want camp to feel exclusive in the sense of like not really being inclusive to every single person who wants to have that experience. It's transformative. It really, truly is. Everything I know about being an educator, I learned at camp. Every single thing I learned about working with kids, I learned at camp. And so I think, again, this work is highly relevant. And it's a conversation that we should be having when we think about staff, when we think about our kids, when we think about inclusivity and belonging. We got to talk about who's there. Mm-hmm. And do we see ourselves there? And so, again, really excited to be here with all of you and my dear friend, Lance.
Yeah. Well, before we get to Lance, I just got to say, we're going to come back to the fact that there you were, somebody grew up on a dirt road, right? Who thought that camp was this crazy thing that rich people did, right?
Yeah.
And yet, as a college student, you took the plunge and went into the woods to live in a tent
literally
for 2 months with kids, right? So, that gives me hope. That gives me a lot of hope. All right, Lance, pass it over to you.
Yeah, so I'll just echo everything that Chanika said and add to it that I have the great good fortune of being Shanika's friend for around 20 years now. I too started in the camp field world at Project Maury, Maury's camp then. Don Ewing is not only a mentor, but a hero, to me, and then also to the industry. I think when we look back at, what we were trying to do at Project Maury in those early days, we'll talk a little bit about that now, is to uplift all humanity. I know that's a phrase that we want to come back to in this talk, and something that I often use. It comes from Dr. Bettina Love, who is at the University of Georgia. It really names what we were learning how to do, and it happened to be at a camp setting where the staff were predominantly white at that time. That's now shifted, and the staff at Project Maury look a lot more like the campers who are predominantly of color. And I learned, like Chanika said, everything I knew about teaching and how to be a teacher from camp. And so then I took that into the classroom and tried to apply it, and have spent, the better part of the last 15 years or so as a researcher practitioner, trying to understand the camp classroom connections, the ways in which camps and classrooms collaborate and have ways of compounding the effect for young people. And so I talk a lot about what it is to be an anti-racist educator. And so naturally, in my interest in how classrooms and camps connect, have become increasingly interested in how camps can be anti-racist. And want to talk more about that, and we're just so happy that we've been
Let's get it rolling. Let's get it rolling,
to
Lance.
follow up.
It's how can day camps be more anti-racist? I think that's a good kickoff to this football game here. Yeah, because it is a unique setting. It's experiential, right? You're not sitting there staring at a teacher and 5 rows of kids. It's hands-on. I mean, can you go on with that a bit?
Yeah, well, I think camp's the perfect place to be, to practice the tenets of anti-racism, especially given that you have young, impressionable campers, and we know that young people are able to have conversations about race, and so often we try to avoid the topic of race, and that does the opposite. It sends the opposite message to kids.
Yeah. So let's just pause on that for a second, because, something that I heard on your ACA webinar is that the very sort of default setting for most camp people, especially most camp white people, is everybody's the same, everybody's equal, so we're not even going to address it because we're all the same. Right.
Yeah.
And what I've read, in the research and the books that I've been doing is that is actually not what you're supposed to do.
Yeah. Well, I'll just say, so the message it sends is not the one we intend it to send. It sends the message to kids that race shouldn't matter, but the message kids get is that race doesn't matter. And we live in a racialized society. We have to recognize that race matters. It's a construct. It doesn't genetically exist. But when we say, let's don't talk about race, we intend to send the message that it shouldn't matter. That's true. It should not matter. But the message that kids get if we don't talk about it is that it doesn't matter. And that's not true, because kids see race as early kindergarten. Kids are having conversations about race. So we can't avoid it. We have to talk about it. And that's part of being anti-racist, is not saying I'm not a racist, which is to avoid it. Anti-racism is actively dismantling it, largely through conversation and systemic, changes.
Yeah. I want to just tack on something to that, Lance. We both love Dr. Bettina Love, who is amazing. And she talks about how, like, our institutions and a lot of our places that supposedly love children are in actuality spirit murdering them. That's the name that she uses for it, which just kind of like stabs you in the heart. And I think one of the ways that does show up is by not acknowledging, like, race, yes, is a construct, but it's real. and we should talk about it. Like, we are a racialized society. We see race. We assign race to people for like the pure purpose of establishing a power hierarchy. We need to acknowledge that. And the reality is, it's the adults that are uncomfortable having the conversation. It's not the kids. A little kid will be the first person to tell you, right? Pre-K, that their friend, talk to me about your friend. Oh, she's Black, has short hair. They can just go.
Yep.
They can just have the whole conversation, or they ask questions, which is so important. And so you'll have the child as young as pre-K again saying, but mommy, why does, right? And we are so quick to shut that conversation down. And I think that's what happens at camps.
Well,
And we need to have that conversation and engage in that dialogue.
and I know that people now are learning about how to talk about this in college. Like, this is a class now, right? For educators. Educators are getting this, right? But for the camp directors now who missed that boat, okay, who are in their 40s and 50s and 60s or whatever, right? And when they have to talk to in training, talk to their leaders of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds, right? I think they're at a loss of how to, they'd rather just not address it than because we don't know how to talk to them about how to talk to their kids in a developmentally appropriate way. Right. And we had a situation at my camp this last summer with a 5 or 6-year-old boy who very innocently said something very mean to a little Black kid, something like, well, you can't have it because your skin's that color, like whatever. Like, this kid just didn't even know what he was saying, but it was just so horrible, And luckily, one of my unit leader was a Black guy. Thank goodness. And he was able to really have a great conversation with him. But I was sort of at a loss of what to say, just because yet I have never been taught myself of how to talk to little kids about that.
I think there's so much richness to so a lot of what you just said, especially I love what you said Bettina calls it spirit murdering, because I think that not only happens in educational systems around race, but also around creativity, around freedom of thought, and so it's a no-brainer that it also happens, in conversations about race. I do think that when you tell people, we're all the same, it erases who they are and takes away part of their identity that really, really does matter. I know one thing that I heard in a conference last year that really resounded with me, and that I think that camp professionals can do is there was a guy and he had like these huge dreads, and they were just like, you look at them in awe. And he was saying how when a white mom walks by with her child and the child is kind of looking and the child is just really curious, the way that mom responds, it puts such an impression on the kids of whether or not going forward they see this as something that's creative and interesting and different, or if they see something that's fearful and how to pull back. And so he just, part of his whole campaign was to teach moms, white women who were interested in correcting their view and their reactions, to say, oh my gosh, honey, look at his hair, isn't it very interesting? And how that child has a totally different experience than if the mom was like, come on, let's go, and like kind of was away. And so I think that that's a major thing that we can do in camps, to like address the elephant in the room, and not to necessarily give someone the excuse that you don't know what you're saying, or if it's hurtful, that the words are hurtful. It just happens to be that these words about race. If you call me ugly, that wasn't nice. So you also knew it wasn't nice to say something about my skin. And so let's not give you the excuse, but to tell you why, like that's not okay. And we need to use our words for, in positive ways. So I think this is such a valuable conversation. And even like Andy said, kudos to you for being willing to go into this new space, having not had that experience, but having seen it and thought something totally different, because I think that that's a huge struggle with people, college students being willing to go, over the mountain and through the woods to get to a camp space. I think it proves you were a risk taker. And I would love to hear thoughts on how we can inspire more people to be willing to take that risk.
I mean, and I can add on, just to segue nicely off of that question, Tiffany. I think what really helped was the conversation with Dawn, like the camp director really reaching out to talk to me directly about what was happening at the camp, what the camp was about, what I stood to gain, of course, as a counselor, and how I could give back, right? And how it was a service that was so important and necessary and that it would be hopefully one of the more pivotal experiences I had ever had. And my 18-year-old self, of course, just ate that up. But I do think that personalized touch mattered. It mattered that I got a postcard in the mail as a prospective hire at that point, hadn't even flown up because I went to undergrad in good old Decatur, Georgia, Agnes Scott, so much pride. I'm a proud Scotty. And so I hadn't even made it to New York. And so to get a postcard, handwritten, that was just really excited to have me come to camp from Lance. I mean, full circle, right? So Lance was the person who wrote that postcard. He didn't know me. I didn't know him, but it helped also to not just have the camp director, but to have a returning staff member say, hey, really can't wait to see you up here. I'm from Georgia too. Like just that level of connectivity. And so I think that's a really tangible way to engage like your whole staff and your returning staff, to have them feel a level of responsibility and an onus as well to be a part of the hiring campaign, and to really energize people like me who had no idea really what I was getting into. So I think that was huge. And for me, even though I was nervous, and I mean, Tiffany, I cried the first night at camp. I mean, bawled like we had lost our first dog. I cried. It was like shell shock. I had no idea what to expect. And the very next day, it was like gone, because I felt completely immersed in the community. So it's not easy, but I do think those touch points on the front end were, I mean, crucial to me actually staying and not hopping on a plane to come back home immediately.
Yeah, well, camps tend to, I mean, Moore's Camp is an exceptional place, but most day camps tend to do a really good job onboarding campers, but not staff.
Yeah.
And staff who are not the typical staff, they should be keenly aware about. There's no doubt.
Yeah, and because of that, I love, like you said, it's simple but powerful. Someone with a commonality, the city, reached out, in a way that made you feel important. And, it was from Dawn, but then also from someone that was very common to you. So when you went, you didn't feel like you were going alone. And it's things like that when people ask me all the time, I'm kind of like, I don't know, because that wasn't my experience. But that, I think it could be a key takeaway for our listeners, creating that commonality between the existing staff and who you're hoping to recruit, and making that personal touch. Awesome.
I know we want to talk about resources and ideas. I think, Andy, you make a good point about how we often center orientation around the onboarding of campers and do less intentionality around the onboarding of staff. And validating and affirming all aspects of an individual's identity is a part of that, so that folks feel like they're seen in that space and that they're welcomed in that space for all the different ways that they are, that are often intersectional. We mentioned this in the webinar, the New York State Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education Framework, even though the word education is there, highly recommend it for camps. It has a set of indicators that you can think about. You just replace students with campers, replace teachers with staff, and replace, school with camp in terms of the organizational piece. And those indicators are really good guidelines for, a day camp that's really serious about taking this on, and really serious about the orientation training piece. And again, it's the New York State Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education Framework. It's really set out to be a checklist, or not, I don't want to say checklist, but kind of a self-assessment as a tool for organizations.
I went to it after you cited it in the webinar. It is like a clearinghouse of resources. It's really great. So we'll have it in our show notes for sure, because it is great to access. No doubt about it. So
I was just thinking as you were speaking, my campers are as diverse as my community, but what I'm finding is for some reason they're not taking on the leadership program, like doing the junior leaders, doing the CITs, and then I have some staff, but I need to do better translating my campers to all of them to thinking that this is something that they could do all the way through. So any suggestions on that end would be helpful too.
Well, I'll do a couple things before we get to our experts. I think that in New Jersey, because minimum wage is raising, I think that working at camp is becoming a more viable financial thing for people of color, because if you're paying people like nothing, then you're just going to have people from wealthy families basically working for you who don't actually need the money. I mean, personally, when I was 16, 17, 18, I needed to make good money because I wanted to get a car and I wanted to do things, and my parents weren't going to give me the money, right? So I think that's part of it. I think the other thing is really focusing your staff recruiting on people who want to work with children. Because like Chanika said, with using her as an example, there's no better place. I mean, if she was going to youth development boot camp, she was either going to survive and become a teacher or decide she was going to change her major, one or the other.
Yes. That's very true. For me, and I think you nailed it, Andy, as well. Like, I think cost effectiveness is real. I think also aligning it to a broader community value is also really important. And so if you can see that your work, even as a teenager at this space, is a way of giving back because it is a communal, familial value that's been instilled in you, then I think you're more likely to be a part of it. I think as well, if you are able to see folks who have done it before kind of come back. So your youth that is now off in undergrad or even in grad school that can remember the wealth of an experience they had as a CIT, coming back to have those conversations, I think are really transformational. You probably are also working with high schools. I was a high school principal for a while, but I think about that community service requirement, which was massive, and we had to have it, and our students had to have it in order to graduate. So if we are able to, like as a day camp, if you're able to connect to the community service liaison to talk about how important that work will be, and to offer it as a resource, I wonder whether or not that would also have more, teenagers being like National Honor Society, beta clubs, like, yes, those are like prime spots, but not to get to, again, it's not the principal, it is the sponsor who is over the community service efforts or NHS beta club, because they are going to be the ones who really do keep this like top of mind for teenagers. Is just a initial thought that came to mind for me.
Yeah, and along with that, colleges and universities are more diverse than ever before. And there are colleges and universities in every community colleges, 4-year, private and public. I mean, there's a range of opportunities to partner. The reason I went to Maurice Camp is because someone at my college told me that was a good idea, that knew Maurice Camp personally. If you can find folks at colleges and universities that can be your advocate and can put a good word in the ear of the students that they know will be a good fit at your day camp, and to find people at the colleges and universities who have touch points with a diverse set of students. Don't go the traditional route of find, the person that, the college might tell you is, make your own personal connections to people who have good networks at the school, who can be the advocate of your camp, and can communicate the message that of the kind of culture that you're trying to build, and don't avoid naming it. If it's your if it's your mission to increase diversity on the staff, then that's the message that a staff person who wants to be at that place needs to hear. So it's not language to avoid, it's language to amplify.
All right, well, before we go on, let's take a little short break. I got to plug our friends at AM Skyer Insurance, because we wouldn't have a podcast if it wasn't for AM Skyer helping sponsor us. They're leading insurance and strategic partner for many of the finest camps in America. For 101 years, AM Skyer has been supporting camps in PR, legal, health, facility management, general safety, and more. Experience the AM Skyer difference at amskyer.com. And, just want to say that when things do go wrong at AM Skyer, when they go wrong in your camp, when you contact them, their legal counsel and their PR arm, they go right into the mode for you. I mean, they'll make copies of things for you. They'll give you all kinds of templates to work off of. It's really nice. It's sort of like having those people, those different agencies working for you, except it's all coming through your one check that you write to your insurance company. So amskyer.com. All right. Anyway, back to the show. Thank you. So can we go back to my little example again of the little kid, about the 6-year-old boy? Okay, faux pas. Because so if most day camps that I know are either 95% white or 95% black. It's like one or the other, right? So if you have so this incident happens, and now you want to debrief it with the children, right, and make it a teachable moment, okay? And from my standpoint, I'm going to be really fearful that I'm going to make it 10 times worse for this poor kid. Like in my stories, the kid of color, right? So any advice on to our friends out there on that kind of thing?
I think what white people often do in these situations is they freak out.
Yeah, we get paranoid, sure.
And that's the exact opposite thing to do. I think what I want to recommend is take a deep breath. Kids mirror behavior. If they see you freaking out, again, it sends the message that this is something to be afraid of. Race is not something to be afraid of. There's nothing wrong with the ways that we identify. In fact, there's everything right with the ways that we identify in our identities. So we don't want to send the message that it's something to freak out about. And then the other thing is to, in that deep breath, think about what's my goal here. It's to make children feel good about who they are, and and my goal is so that they have a successful experience next time. So how do we do that? Well, we talk. So in this instance, I think what you say to the kid that made the statement is something like, and I would do this private. It's not public. And think about if it were my own family member. So let's just say let's say my nephew. I'm not a father, but I'm an uncle. And my 6-year-old nephew said something that is offensive. Then I want to know more about what's going on. And I want to say, I'll use another name, Adam. I know you have Black friends, and I know you love your Black friends. So what do you think the people you love, or how do you think the people you love would feel when you say something like that?
Well, I was just joking around, Lance.
Yeah, and we all like to joke around, and it's not we learned that from Bob Ditter. And how's that going? Because you're absolutely right. And that's another Bob Ditter, make kids write about what they're right about. So you're absolutely right. We like to joke around, and you may have been playing. And how would that make someone you love feel? And I think it's okay to call kids out on feelings.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing from you, just going from the first part of what you said, is to normalize the behavior, right? So even though, like I always say to my staff, it's inappropriate, but it's age appropriate. So, like you said, don't panic and just treat it like the kid punched somebody in the head. It's like the same sort of thing. Like, we got to learn not to do that. Right.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Tiffany.
Oh, no.
I think the thing that comes to mind for me a lot, when working with kids and trying to have the conversation, it's really getting kids to, again, see each other. And so the response, when you're asking the question of the child, like what was their intention, I think it's also to ask, like, did you notice how Lance responded? Like, how did he respond when you said that? To see, right? Like that's the switch that you want to turn on for kids. It's not always what your intention was, it's the impact. And so how quickly can we get them to connect the two? The words that are coming out of your mouth, regardless of intention, will have an impact. And it is our duty to make sure that that impact, if you ask me, I always say to kids, I'm like, it has to be neutral or positive. Like if we are really doing, if we're really responsible, highly, attuned social emotional beings, my goodness, like our goal cannot be to wake up every day figuring out how we just gonna make someone feel miserable. And so it really is to think about the words that you say having a neutral or a positive impact. And so did you see how Lance responded? Yeah, he stopped playing. He kind of just, he walked away from me. Did you want him to walk away from you? No, I thought I was being funny. Right? It's like, how do you get them to connect the dots? And so I think being really targeted with the questions that you're asking so that they can start to see that, and then illuminating that for them, that everything has an impact. And so we have to think about that with our words. Is the only other thing I would add on to Lance's point that I just try to give to my staff at any point in time, working with students, to think like, how do you ask the questions? And it's always a question and not a value judgment and a statement, right? Because I think to Lance's point, it's, you make the kid right about what they're right about, but they also, no one's learning a lesson when they feel like the worst person on the planet and they feel evil. Kids don't learn anything when they feel like you have demonized them.
Great point.
And so I think that's important too.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
go ahead, Tim.
the overall theme that I hear is just like empathy, like building empathy in children. And if they recognize that they're making someone else feel a way, then I think that they are better at, fixing their behavior. The other thing is, though, there are some kids, especially like in my camp, were like, yeah, I made them feel that way. And that was my intent to make them feel that way. And I'm glad that they feel that way. And you're just like, okay, well, that's not okay. And this is why. And you wouldn't want anyone that you love to be made feel that way. So, you may not have Black friends and you may not love, anybody that doesn't look like you, but to recognize that there are people who you do love and you wouldn't want them to feel that way. And I think that that's so much more powerful than just like treat people how you would want to be treated, because what I get from other kids is like, I don't care. It don't bother me. So if it doesn't bother them, that's a cop out, but they always care about their mom. They always care, so they can always relate to who else they care about. And so just building that empathy lens from that perspective. And Andy, I was going to say, because I think my white friends definitely freak out about it too, because it's really from a very innocent place. They just don't want to get it wrong, right? And they're just like, I don't know what to say, Tiff, and I'm just like, treat it like you would any other insult. Treat it like you would any other, if you're using your words as a weapon, whether you're just calling me a name or you're calling me a racial name, it's still just an insult. So we treat it the same way. And it doesn't only come, literally we are talking about, white camps and race, white camp providers and race and bringing more people of color in, but we have a huge colorism issue among the Black community. And so I definitely have like campers. If I have, my coaches are typically collegiate athletes, and a lot of them have come from like, more well-to-do families, and I serve children who are economically disadvantaged. And so, I have to help even my coaches recognize that my children, like, you have to separate behaviors from people, and that it's not the same, and that you can't, you weren't born into their circumstance. Sometimes kids have had to use, fighting as a way of survival. So you have to put yourself in their shoes and not just, have these ideals. And so I think that I used to own an all-state agency, and this is a random example or comparison, but when my other agents would go through an app and they would ask like, what's your name, what's your phone number, what's your social security number, every time they would say social security number, they would freeze up because they feel like that's personal, I shouldn't ask them. And the client on the other end of the phone could tell. So when you're freaking out, like Lan said, the kids can feel that energy. And if you're freaking out, then they're freaking out. So I would say ask for a social security number as matter-of-factly as you ask for their name. And once they changed that in their mind, it changed everything. And they were whipping through apps. And so the same thing, like, you deal with behavior issues all the time. And at camp, we're very lucky to be able to deal with them in a very different way than the traditional education system does. We don't just send people to the office. We don't just kick them out. We dig deep to find out why and to help, change those behaviors and let it be an intrinsic thing that the kids feel, so that like we're leading them to their own conclusion that they need to behave better. And so I think, if we all look at it as, not freaking out and just saying like, okay, I am uncomfortable with this, but I'm gonna put my game face on when I'm talking to you. I feel great talking about Black folks. I feel great talking, even though that's not who you are. And if you're corrected, like, it's okay. Or if you get it wrong, it's okay. We don't get it right all the time about anything. So why would we expect you to get it right? Like, the point is that you're trying. And I think that we just need to make an effort to try and not just like, fight.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds to me like you have these camps filled with hundreds of very, very nice, well-meaning people avoiding the topic, right? That seems like the Achilles heel.
I
Yeah.
have a situation happening right now where two brothers continually get in trouble. And every time they get in trouble, they blame another student who happens to be Black. Well, I've been dealing with each situation. These are the facts. They haven't even interacted. They didn't even play together today. Their behavior has nothing to do with this other person. And I'm to the point now where the pattern is such that they're using him as a scapegoat. And I'm going to have to talk to the parents, I think, to get to the underlying, okay, we've done what we can do, at this point, we need, where do I go from here kind of thing.
Yeah, I think, Tiffany, your point, that you said, very humorously, I think is also very serious, is that people have to be more comfortable talking about race, especially white people. And Sam, to your point, in this instant, what you're describing are, the products of stereotype and biases that have been taught to people through our culture, through our media, through the media, through the reinforcement of those biases and stereotypes. And so it's no surprise that young people project those. And I think what has to happen, though, is exactly what you say, is we have to address. And my point is, we have to be comfortable talking about it. And we have to be comfortable telling the truth to young people, which is that we live in a racialized society. We live in a society that has centered whiteness. And so therefore, Black people get blamed for everything. And what you're describing is something that white people have learned to do from somewhere. And I think it can be traced back to society. And my point about truth telling is that we have to be comfortable talking about the history of racial oppression in this country. And we have to be comfortable describing what is often whitewashed in schools to kids about how people of color and more so Black people through the period of enslavement, Indigenous people through the period of genocide. We have to talk about these things, which have led to the perpetuation of stereotypes and biases that lead to the kind of projection that you're describing, where a white kid can blame a Black kid for something, because in a white-centered society, that's what happens. Yeah. And that's what I mean by being anti-racist. We have to be willing to take a stand in those situations, to describe to kids what's going on, to young people what's going on, to normalize the behavior so that they don't feel vilified, as Chanika said, because then they don't learn anything from it. But to help kids understand, this is where it's coming from. This is, a product of 400 years and 12 generations of oppression. And then this is what it looks like. And to be comfortable talking about it with young people in conversation, so that they learn not to do that. Because what you're describing, often we said this in one of the early race conversations webinar. If the officer who murdered George Floyd had someone like a camp counselor have a conversation like you're describing, or a teacher have a conversation about the stereotypes and biases, would more people be alive today? Would more Black people be alive today? And who've suffered at the hands of the violence that that gets perpetuated. And what you're describing is, what leads to violence eventually, because our thoughts become our words become our actions, and so we have to interrupt it. And that's why camps are so important, because that's where lessons are learned that can really have consequences for folks down the road.
Wow, this has been a tremendous conversation, one that we don't want to make too long because there's lots of good stuff here that needs to be digested. So what we're going to do is we're going to break this into a part 1, which you've been listening to, and a part 2, which is going to come out next week on Tuesday morning. So hope you enjoyed the part 1 of our DEI pod with Lance and Chanika, and we look forward to finishing up with you with some really great stuff and some really tremendous resources next Tuesday on the Day Camp Pod.